Imagine sitting across the table from some of the most powerful men in one of the world's most secretive regimes. Not as a spy, not as a diplomat, but as someone they trusted. Now imagine walking away from that world and deciding to tell everyone exactly what you saw. That is the story of Catherine Perez-Shakdam. And once you hear what she claims happened behind closed doors, you'll understand why governments are paying attention. Iran is one of the most talked about countries in the world right now. Sanctions, nuclear negotiations, proxy wars, street protests. But most people only see the surface, the government press releases, the carefully staged speeches, the polished propaganda. What if someone had actually been inside, close to the ideology, close to the people who run it, and then came out the other side willing to talk? That is exactly what Catherine Perez-Shakdam claims to have done. And her account of what Iran's regime is really like from the inside is something Washington, London, and Tel Aviv have all taken note of. Today, we're going to break it all down. Who she is, what she says she witnessed, why it matters, and why if even part of what she describes is accurate, it should concern every single one of us. So who is this woman? Catherine Perez-Shakdam is a French political analyst and journalist who has built her career around some of the most dangerous ideological movements of our time: terrorism, radicalization, and the inner workings of the Iranian regime. She has appeared in major international media. She has testified before governmental and policy bodies. And she has written extensively on the theocratic architecture of the Islamic Republic, how it thinks, how it operates, and what it ultimately wants. But her background is not straightforward. Perez-Shakdam comes from a Jewish family, and yet, according to her own account, she spent years moving in circles closely aligned with the Iranian establishment. Circles that, in their official ideology, view Israel and Jewish identity as existential enemies. How does that happen? How does someone with that background end up with access to those spaces? That question alone is what makes her story so difficult to look away from. She has described her journey as one of deep infiltration, not in the spy thriller sense, but in the sense of ideological immersion, of going so far inside a world to understand it that the lines at times became dangerously blurred. Here is where things get genuinely complicated. In interviews, Perez-Shakdam has claimed to have met and interacted with senior figures within the Iranian establishment, including, she has said, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself. Now let's be precise here. These are her claims. They have not been independently verified in full, and some observers have questioned the details. That is important context, but the broader picture she paints of how the regime's inner circle operates, how they think, what they believe they are building, that picture has been taken seriously by analysts and researchers who study Iran professionally. And this is where the story gets darker, because according to Perez-Shakdam, the regime is not simply a political system. It is, she argues, a deeply ideological and even apocalyptic project, one that genuinely believes it is on a divine mission. Not performing belief for the cameras, actually believing it. If that is accurate, it changes the entire calculation about how the West should deal with Iran. You can negotiate with a government that wants power and money. It is much harder to negotiate with a system that believes it answers to God and is waiting for the end of days. So what does Catherine Perez-Shakdam actually describe when she talks about Iran from the inside? Several themes come up consistently in her interviews and writing. First, fear as the primary tool of governance. The regime does not rely solely on ideology to maintain control. It relies on terror. Not just the threat of prison, though that is very real, but the fear that spreads through families, communities, and entire professional networks. One arrest doesn't just destroy one person, it silences dozens around them. Second, the gap between the public face and the private reality. According to Perez-Shakdam, the regime is extraordinarily skilled at presenting one version of itself to the outside world, measured, strategic, even diplomatic, while operating on completely different principles internally. The propaganda machine, she argues, is not just aimed at foreign audiences. It is aimed at the Iranian people themselves constantly, relentlessly. Third, the role of radical ideology in every decision. This is perhaps the most disturbing element of her account. She has argued that ideology, specifically the regime's interpretation of Shia Islam filtered through Khomeini's political theology, is not window dressing. It genuinely shapes policy. From proxy militias in Lebanon and Yemen to the nuclear program, the framework, she says, is theological as much as it is geopolitical. And then there is a fourth element, the cracks. Because for all its projection of power and divine mandate, Perez-Shakdam has suggested the regime knows it is losing the people. The protests that erupted after Mahsa Amini's death in 2022 weren't just a moment of grief. They were, in her reading, a symptom of something deeper, a population that has stopped believing the story it has been told. Let's zoom out for a second. Why should someone in the United States care about the testimony of a French analyst, however controversial, about the internal culture of Iran's leadership? Here is why. Iran is not a contained problem. It funds Hezbollah in Lebanon. It supports Hamas in Gaza. It arms the Houthis in Yemen, who have been attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea, directly disrupting global trade. It has provided drone technology to Russia used against civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. Iran's reach extends far beyond its borders, and the decisions that drive all of that reach are made by the men in the system that Perez-Shakdam says she witnessed firsthand. Understanding how that system actually thinks, not how it wants to be seen, but how it actually functions, matters enormously. And right now, the regime is under more domestic pressure than it has been in decades. The economy is struggling. The youth are increasingly alienated. The protests keep coming back, even after brutal crackdowns. Supporters of Perez-Shakdam's analysis argue that the regime's aggression abroad is not a sign of strength. It is a sign of a system that needs external enemies to hold itself together internally. Think about that. If that reading is correct, then every time there is a confrontation in the region, in the nuclear talks, anywhere, there is a regime on the other side that may be calculating not just geopolitically, but existentially, fighting not just for influence, but for survival. Now here is the question that really lingers. What happens if Iran's regime continues to fracture from within? History gives us uncomfortable answers. Regimes that feel cornered don't always retreat quietly. Sometimes they escalate. Sometimes the most dangerous moment for the outside world is not when an authoritarian government is strong. It is when it is starting to feel weak. Perez-Shakdam has been consistent in her view that the regime's days of maintaining its current form are numbered. She has argued that the ideological foundation is eroding, that ordinary Iranians, especially the young, have fundamentally rejected the Islamic Republic's vision. But, and this is critical, she has also warned that the transition away from that system, if and when it comes, will not be clean or peaceful. Regimes built on this level of ideological control and military enforcement do not hand over the keys. Critics of Perez-Shakdam argue that her framing can be too black and white, too focused on the regime as a monolith, when in reality there are factions, moderates, and internal power struggles that complicate the picture. That is a fair pushback. No regime of this size and complexity is a single mind, but even her critics rarely dispute the core premise that what the Iranian regime presents to the outside world and what actually happens inside the machinery of its power are two very different things. Here is what we're left with. A woman who claims extraordinary access to one of the world's most closed systems, a set of accounts that are disputed in parts, taken seriously in others, and impossible to fully ignore. A regime that has survived for over 4 decades through fear, ideology, and an unmatched ability to control the story it tells about itself. And a moment in history where that story appears, for the first time in a long time, to be visibly coming apart at the seam. Catherine Perez-Shakdam's claims may not all be verifiable, her story may be complicated, but the questions she raises about how power really works inside Tehran, about what the men at the top actually believe, about how long a government can rule through fear before the people stop being afraid, those questions are not going away. And in a world where Iran's decisions affect oil prices, shipping lanes, regional wars, and American foreign policy, understanding what is really happening inside that regime isn't just interesting, it is essential.